Hello, this is Aaron Wren, and my special guest today is arguably the leading scholar and public intellectual on family life in America, and that is Brad Wilcox. He is a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia and the author of the new book you should Get Married: Why Americans Must Defy Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. There is a link to buy that in the show notes, so be sure to check it out. Also, be sure to hit subscribe, to hit like on my YouTube channel, and there's a link to subscribe to my newsletter as well if you don't have it. So, Brad, thanks for joining me today to talk about your book.
Wonderful to be here with you today, Aaron.
I want to start off by reading a quote from your book and have you expand on it. You say, quote, "The bad news about family life in America is that a large and growing minority of men and women will not marry or have children, leaving them without any immediate kin as they head into midlife and later life. This is sobering because many of them will end up aging and dying essentially alone, largely unvisited and uncared for in their final years by anyone but a nursing home attendant, home healthcare aide, or care robot." Unquote. That's a pretty bleak view of what's going on in our society. What is happening to cause this situation?
Well, I think there are obviously a lot of things we're seeing playing out, Aaron, in terms of understanding why marriage rates are falling so precipitously. Part of the story here, I think, is what I call kind of the Midas mindset, where a lot of young adults today are under the impression that what really matters in life is your education, building your own brand, and especially kind of investing your life in a career. That these are kinds of the three pillars to a good life, to a fulfilling life, to a meaningful life. So that's, I think, part of the problem, that there's this sort of false orientation to a kind of more individualistic and workist or careerist kind of approach to life. The second problem, though, touches on some themes that you've written a lot about, Aaron, and that is that particularly, I think, for working class, poor men and men, young men from those communities, and men, obviously, kind of more generally, younger men more generally, we're seeing kind of what I would call kind of a male malaise, where too many young men are failing to flourish in school, in a technical college, or in the workplace as early 20-something guys. And so partly as a consequence, they're less likely to be attractive as boyfriends and especially as husbands. And if they do get married, they're more likely to end up in divorce court because they're not stably employed, or they're not otherwise as likely to be contributing in important, valuable ways to their relationship towards their kids, towards, the maintenance of the home, so to speak. So these two different dynamics mean that for, I think, many young adults, marriage is less basically attractive compared to some other key life goals, like having lots of money or lots of free time or an outstanding career. And it's less attainable, in part because the kinds of men who are available to marry are less marriageable, especially, I think, for working class and poor women. So these are, there are many dynamics obviously in play the book touches on, but those two, I think, are especially salient ones to think about why we're seeing marriage, come down, and why my colleague Lyman Stone projects that about 1 in 3 young adults today will never marry, which is, of course, record demographic territory.
Yeah, that was one of the things I saw in the book, was that 25% of 40-year-olds have never been married. And so that is the millennial demographic. I believe with Generation X, it was something like 12% never married by age 40. And we'd seen that the age of marriage, average age of marriage, had been getting higher. People were deferring marriage, but I'd always thought, even based on my generation, that people were basically going to land the plane, that at some point they would end up getting married. But now we're seeing that that's not happening to more people than we thought it was in the past. A third of people never marrying, that's a lot.
Yeah, and I think you kind of just have to unpack this, right? So you just kind of look around at young adults today, and the pervasiveness of what I call electronic opiates, both in terms of gaming and social media, means that they're not really accumulating both the kind of skills socially and the opportunities to meet people in as large numbers, I think, as they should be. And that inhibits dating, obviously, which inhibits marriage. And then two, the fact that, a lot of our cultural messaging has turned in an anti-nuptial direction and a much more kind of pro-career or pro just kind of living your own life, not caring for others in any kind of fundamental way, much more individualistic direction. That kind of only, I think, deepens the challenge facing young adults today.
You seem very attuned to the Charles Murray idea that our elites don't preach what they practice. That is, we see all this messaging about why marriage is essentially an optional part of life and that these other things should take priority. And yet the people with the most education, income, etc., tend to live pretty traditional lives in terms of getting married, staying married, have kids, etc. Is that why you say we have to defy elites?
Yeah, it's funny, when I first released the title of the book on Twitter, I had some pushback from elite journalists who were like, what are you talking about? The elites in America today are doing fine when it comes to getting married and staying married. And, obviously they hadn't read the book, couldn't have read the book at that point. So they missed the point, which of course is, our elites are doing fine, at least right now, when it comes to getting married and staying married. But the messaging that they're giving is often kind of pointing us in the wrong direction. And the irony is that one of those elites who kind of had that quick Twitter response himself had written a piece for Vox that said something like, "The decline of marriage is no problem," was like the headline in Vox. So it's like, and he himself is married, with a child and clearly doing well, I think, on the family front. So didn't quite get the point that, yes, many of our elites are in private, kind of in a sense, walking right. They're living marriage-centered, family-centered lives. But when it comes to kind of their public pronouncements, they're either often denying or devaluing marriage, just kind of discounting it or not saying anything about it. So I'm thinking about rights of journalists, thinking about professors, I'm thinking about university presidents, I'm thinking about school superintendents, I'm thinking about Hollywood moguls, who again are often living very marriage-centered, family-centered lives in private, and yet can't muster a good word to say about marriage in public, and also are not necessarily supporting the kinds of virtues that would sustain strong marriages among the population more generally. So that's sort of this dynamic that I call talking left and then walking right, again, to describe how our elites often approach marriage and family life more generally.
It seems like there's almost a social stigma against talking about being happily married. You do occasionally see an op-ed from someone that's like, "I am happily married, but I feel like I shouldn't say that among my friends." But most of what you read in the media is stories of people's marriages going badly or the struggles of being a mother, or it almost all gives you a very negative impression of what it means to be married and have kids. You even see this in the religious literature. I mentioned that Russell Moore had written this book called The Storm-Tossed Family. And it's like a picture of a house, like, and the seas, this, kind of, gray skies and seas this storm. It's like, here's all the horrible things that could happen to you when you get married. And I'm like, no wonder people don't want to get married when you read what people talk about, what it is like.
Yeah, so I think what's striking is how much of the messaging from mainstream media outlets has been off the mark here. So Bloomberg ran a story that said basically women who stay single are getting richer, compared to married, especially married mothers. The New York Times had a piece that said married motherhood in America is a game no one wins. So again, kind of as you were, indicating, a lot of messaging that kind of discounts marriage and parenthood, especially motherhood, kind of suggests that, these are pathways to misery and immiseration. And the irony, though, is that no group of Americans are more financially secure than married men and women, contra Bloomberg. The story there was they were relying upon a study from the Fed of singles and somehow managed to try to draw inferences about marriage, which are completely wrong. And then, of course, no group of Americans today are happier than married dads and married mothers, contra what that New York Times writer was saying. So that's the that's the truth, is it actually the path to prosperity and happiness. Now, I'm not saying you're obviously constantly blissful as a married mom or married dad. Obviously you're not. Lots of tough things, lots of sacrifice, lots of suffering, lots of late nights. We could go on and on about the difficulties of being a spouse and especially a parent. But in general, on average, Americans who are married with kids are much more likely to be flourishing. Not only they're happier, but they're less lonely. We published a piece in Family Studies yesterday saying they're less likely to say that their mental health is in bad shape. So there's just kind of this striking gap between a lot of the rhetoric around family life and the reality that my book is underlining.
The thing that I've noticed in the last couple years is that the new thing that the media has been promoting is this idea that women should divorce husbands who are, by their own admission, great husbands and fathers. There was a big thing about Adele in Vogue that was like that, basically, how she had to go find herself or something like that. Laura Bazelon wrote one in the Times. I'm like, this is crazy. You guys all say, yeah, my husband's awesome guy, great dad, and I'm divorcing him anyway. It's like really a weird kind of message to be sending out to people.
Yeah, no, it is quite bizarre that there are all these pieces, that you touch on. There's another piece in the Atlantic on this too, that just are basically women saying that, yeah, their husbands are good guys. Yeah, they might even still love them in some kind of way, but they just need to divorce them to be free and to kind of do the next thing. The Atlantic famously talked about trying shrooms and multiple partners, and I think having more time to write. So that's why she divorced her husband and the father of her 3 children. It's just like, what? Can you say that? Yeah. And of course, the irony here, right, Aaron, is that we would never get a crop of articles that would be taking this line from the husband's perspective. So You've seen so many articles where wives are basically saying, yes, I got divorced. It's a good thing. And yes, my husband's a pretty good guy, or I still loved him, but I just needed to do it to be free, basically.
Yeah.
But I've not read one of those pieces published in a mainstream outlet from a guy kind of making the same argument about the value of divorcing his wife for really no good reason.
Who are the people who are actually getting married today? Is there some difference between the people who get married and don't get married?
So what my book, suggests, and kind of to take the conversation in a more of a positive direction, is that there are still groups of Americans who are succeeding at marriage, especially kind of relative to the broader population. And those full groups are Asian Americans, they're religious Americans, they're college-educated Americans, I call them strivers in the book, and they're conservative Americans. And Aaron, when I first began this project, I anticipated the first 3, Asians, religious, and college-educated Americans, being like this successful crowd. But as I was doing regressions with my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang, what we found was that conservatives sort of kind of stood out when it came to both their odds of being married in the first place and their odds of being happily married in the second place, even controlling for things like ethnicity and race and education and religion. And so as I thought more about that, I think what's happening here is that there are obviously both kind of religious sources of formation in American life today, but also more conservative outlets as well. And people who are kind of following conservative thought leaders and other, media, kind of outlets are still getting a comparatively marriage-friendly message, especially compared to what they might read, and come across in many mainstream media outlets. And one striking example of that lately is on this issue of polyamory and fidelity. So we're seeing now striking differences by ideology in whether or not, young adults especially are open to polyamory, and whether or not they think that kind of fidelity is always, the best thing in marriage. And these are kind of very recent gaps that have emerged ideologically, but they're in the direction of the conservatives being much more likely to affirm the importance of monogamy and fidelity, not to with sort of, or not, withstanding some of the obviously prominent political examples of Republicans who've not, followed this path.
Yeah, I mean, it really is striking. Now, I think one of the things you do note this in the book, and you certainly joust with these people all the time, there are plenty of people on the predominantly online right who really argue against marriage. They're as explicitly militantly anti-marriage as any other group. but maybe they're disproportionate in their online presence relative to the world at large. Where I think
Yeah,
the
so I think
average Republican kind of conservative person still wants to get married.
so what's I think complicated here, right, is that there are a decent number, a minority of men, right, who've been divorced unwillingly, and we can get to this in a second, and also young men too who are having difficulty finding someone to date and marry, right?
Hmm.
So, and I think we're sort of beginning to see a kind of modified South Korea scenario play out here, right? South Korea is known recently for having a lot of younger women in their 20s move to the left, and then a lot of younger men move to the right in a context where there is relatively little dating, relatively little marriage, relatively little childbearing in South Korea. There's a kind of poisonous wall that's kind of emerged dividing the sexes in South Korea. And on the left side of this wall are a lot of women, and on the right side of this wall are a lot of men. Of course, there are plenty of South Koreans and also Americans who are in the middle. But I just think the dynamic here is that there are young men and middle-aged men who have had, either bad experiences with women or no experience with women, and they're susceptible to the kind of red pill, um, view that's articulated by people like Pearl Davis and Andrew Tate. And they're going to be part of the broader conservative coalition moving forward, both for better and for worse, most certainly.
Yeah. So we know that the media is sort of anti-marriage in a sense, or tend to downplay it. We know these online right people are sort of anti-marriage. But what's the positive case for marriage? What do you actually gain from being married?
Well, I think it's important to note, kind of on a very pedestrian note to begin with, is that, financially, women and men who get and stay married just do much better when it comes to their income and their accumulation of assets. They tend to kind of spend more prudentially than their single and cohabiting peers. They experience a lot less, obviously, family instability, and that's a big source of, eroding assets. If you get divorced, obviously you're tending to having to split up a house or some other kind of assets. It's going to, spend money on lawyers and things like that. And if you don't get married, though, often you are moving in and out of relationships, often moving in and out of apartments. You're not accumulating assets in that way. So there's just a way in which marriage tends to sort of steer both women and men in a better financial direction. And so when they get to their 50s, kind of on the verge of retirement, we see is that for both married men and married women who are stably married, they have about 10 times the assets as their never married male and female peers. It's a huge, huge divide. So financially, there's just no question that, and money still matters, obviously, today in very important ways. So that's one thing I would say. But, beyond that, I think it's just important to sort of underline the ways in which, number one, if you have kids, and most people still have kids and will have kids today, your kids are just much more likely to flourish, when you're stably married to the other parent. We know, for instance, just to take boys, for instance, one of the most striking things that I find in the book is that boys who are raised apart from an intact family are more likely to end up in prison or in jail than they are to graduate from college.
Wow.
And by contrast, boys who are raised in an intact family with both their parents at home, kind of in their corner, are about 4 times more likely to graduate from college than they are to spend any time in jail or in prison. So pretty a striking pattern. And I think people who are kind of discounting the value of marriage for kids, like that San Francisco lawyer you mentioned writing in the New York Times celebrating her divorce, just need to get up on the research. But then for adults, though, I think it's just important to note that for most of us, having someone to come home to, having someone to console us when things are going badly, having someone to share our biggest and best, but also worst moments is just incredibly valuable. We are kind of hardwired to connect. We are, in Aristotle's terms, social animals. And so having the benefit of a co-pilot on the journey of life is a good and great thing. And there's just no question that married men and women are less lonely. They report more meaningful lives, and they're happier, especially married moms and married dads in midlife, because there's just so much going on in their lives. And of course, it's busy, it's stressful, all that. Yeah, I know. But again, compared to what, right?
Mm.
I'm here reminded of sort of Churchill's line about democracy. It's the worst, kind of political experience compared to, Churchill said basically democracy is the best form of governance compared to the alternatives. And I think that's the same thing is true of kind of being a married parent. It's challenging and tough, but it's a lot better than the alternatives for most of us.
Yeah, your book really makes a lot of the same points that I guess what's named Melissa Carney made in The Two-Parent Advantage. It's so overwhelming, the advantage of growing up with an intact biological parents compared to any other arrangement. That it's just mind blowing, especially when you like the one that really got my attention, and you've written this elsewhere, is that when one of your parents is cohabitating with an unrelated adult, typically mom and mom's boyfriend, the children are 10 times more likely to suffer from some form of abuse than if you're living in an intact biological family. That is enormous disparities.
Right. Of course, it's important to note here, thankfully, that most kids are not sexually and emotionally and physically abused. So we're still talking about, a relatively small number of cases, but there's just no question that kids who are in, unstable homes are more likely to experience, neglect and abuse and other, forms of, stress and difficulty. Again, at the same time, I was raised by a single mom. Many kids who are raised by single parents turn out fine. It's important to acknowledge that. We know that obviously Barack Obama and Jeff Bezos, professionally at least, were very successful. So
my parents were divorced, so I was raised by a single mom.
Yeah. So, but we also have to just kind of, acknowledge just the broader pattern that Melissa Kearney and I touch on in our books, which is that kids are more likely to flourish when they have the benefit of their own married parents at home. And, that's something that we can't decide of. But again, when I wrote this book, I really wanted to talk more about adults because I've been writing about kids and marriage for, 2 decades now, Aaron. But what I'm seeing at the University of Virginia is that more and more students, particularly younger women, are approaching me and saying, basically, they have, a lot of fear and trepidation. They can't find, young men who are worthy of dating in their estimation. They don't think a lot of these guys are in commitment. There are obviously fewer men than women at UVA, for instance. This is true across the board, we know, in colleges, universities. And so there's a kind of a pervasive kind of, I think, concern about what, their prospects are for marriage. And so with this book, I wanted to focus more on the ways in which, marriage benefits adults, and kind of then to encourage both explicitly and implicitly younger adults to be more intentional about getting their game up, especially for the young men, and being aware of the opportunities that they have in college and elsewhere to meet someone who might be a great spouse down the road.
Yeah, that's a point I've made. You look at like how, like a military operation, people plan getting into the school they want or getting the career that they want.
Right.
And yet when it comes to getting married, it's like, we don't do that. It's like, it's like, well, it'll happen or it won't happen, or we'll get on the dating app. But imagine if we took that perspective on getting into college. Nobody takes that perspective on getting into college today. My generation maybe did, but like not today. And
Right.
So I think it is interesting. You make a great point that you have to be intentional today about that. I am curious, like, of people who don't get married, about how much do you think is a result of people making a conscious decision, I don't want to be married or I don't want to have kids, versus people who would say they wanted it, but it
Right.
just didn't happen and they feel like they don't have the right partner or whatever?
Yeah, I think, and my colleague Dan Cox at the American Enterprise Institute has written more about this issue and done a lot of polling on kind of dating and young adult views about love and relationships. So, if you want to look at that question in more detail, you can check out his work. But I think it's more about, sins of omission rather than sins of commission here, right? So I think it's more about people not having a clear plan and not having clear norms and not having parents and professors, kind of encourage them early enough to kind of get, I think by the time they're hitting 28, 29, 30, well, then your parents begin to sort of like weigh in, well, but it might be too late at that point, right, Aaron? So I think what we could do is to think about not only encouraging young adults themselves to be more deliberate about, looking around in classes, joining volunteer organizations, at their college, or if they're not in college, in their local community. And if they're religious, going to church, all these things that kind of put them in contact with other adults who might be, good prospects. So we need more of that. We need more young men kind of taking the initiative to ask someone out on a date. And I say young men because we know that women actually tend to prefer being asked out by the guy rather than vice versa. So I think that's why it's particularly important to encourage our younger men to take more initiative here. But beyond the kind of like personal responsibility, messaging that I'm giving you right now, we need to also kind of think about creating a broader context where the adults who surround our young adults are encouraging them, helping them, being more, play the matchmaker more than they currently do. And then organizing, socials, dances, other kinds of activities that throw young adults, together in contexts that are conducive to finding someone for marriage.
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, I would say, like, people today want to hide out on online apps where they can just swipe in essentially a risk-free environment. And if you're a man who, the social kind of script is still that the man is expected to initiate, in a sense. If you're actually willing to, in the real world, go up and initiate a conversation with a woman and ask her on a date, you're definitely setting yourself apart from the crowd. No question about that.
Exactly.
Which is not to say that, women, don't have things they can do as well. Typically, men don't like to approach women unless they have some indication that she would welcome that. And so there's things you can do there too, but we don't educate people about those. Nor do we, again, try, not even if you forget about directly setting someone up on a blind date or something, but just, bringing people together and maybe encouraging this guy, hey, you might want to take a look over here. And letting him take it from there. That's how the person that introduced my wife and I did it. She just made the introduction, left it at that. There's a lot that can be done, I think, there.
Exactly. Sure. Right.
Now, again, I mentioned these men that you've been jousting with a lot for several years now. And so one of the lines that you have in your book, you say, the institution of marriage helps men settle down, work harder and smarter, and steer clear of trouble. When you read something like that, the online right crowd, the MGTOW crowd, is like the men going their own way who say you shouldn't get married. You're a man, you shouldn't get married. They would say that's great for other people, but how's that great for men? Like settling down, working harder, all of this stuff. It's good. We see why society likes that. We see why that. But how does that benefit the man that he's actually working more hours and probably giving most of that money to his wife or kids and not really getting to enjoy it himself, probably experiencing a decline in leisure time? How do you respond to something like that?
Yeah, and what's striking too, right, about this kind of line of argument is it's so, parallels the arguments that are being delivered to women too about the downsides to getting married and having kids. Like you just lose a lot more me time, you're financially vulnerable in some ways, there's just, so much of your life is going to live for others is basically that part of the critique here, right? So, of course, it's just kind of striking, kind of the naivete, I would say, of the MGTOW crowd, right? And that is that there's just a ton of psychological research, right? That tells us that people are generally happier when they're living more generous lives, that kind of pursuing your own narrow self-interest, going from one dopamine hit on, to another, either on the internet or in the real world. It can give you momentary fleeting pleasure, but it's not going to make for a meaningful and generally happy life long term. And there's, no group of guys who are more likely to end up, dying deaths of despair, suicide, alcoholism, drug overdoses than less educated men who are single. So they just don't understand that for most of us, women and men, having someone to live for, having someone's plural kids to live for, ends up being an incredibly wonderful thing, not a burden. And I guess the sort of the one, I guess, comparison one could make here, right, is to think about just sort of the benefits of exercise in the, I know that you're someone who hits the gym regularly. If you're kind of beginning your routine, it can be painful and annoying, but the more you do it, the stronger you feel and the better you feel. And the same thing is true for like being attentive to your spouse, being engaged with your children. I hate playing board games, for instance, but if I actually sit down and play a board game with my kids, they love it. And, midway through the game, like I'm actually having a good time. Right. So That's one example. I'm saying there are many other examples that one could give, like riding bikes with your children in the neighborhood, watching your kid, star in a school play. I mean, these are things that bring enormous joy to us. And I just, I actually kind of feel sorry for the guys who would make the argument that you're going to be better off, living an atomistic life with no one who cares for you or loves you.
I'm glad I'm not the only one who doesn't like board games. But yeah, I notice these guys tend to be younger. They're under 35 overwhelmingly for the most part, because the idea of like going out and partying and having fun and playing the video games and everything else that you do sounds great when you're younger, but when you're 45, 55, 65, that's not a very attractive lifestyle. Particularly when many of your buddies move on and get married and aren't hanging out with you anymore, or they die or whatever. And it's like all of a sudden you find yourself alone. Not a good place to be.
Yeah, there's obviously also kind of an unwillingness to recognize that many of the world's great traditions, be they religious or classical, stress the importance of both a certain measure of asceticism and obviously a certain regard for either the body politic or for the family, depending upon the thinker. But they're kind of basically making the point to men that, having some kind of profound social orientation is a good thing. So they're missing all that.
Yeah. Now, the one thing you do mention in your book is that one of the exceptions, or a couple exceptions you give to marriages being good. One is if you're in an abusive marriage.
Sure.
The other is if you end up getting divorced.
Right.
And 40% of all marriages still do end in divorce. And as you note, the overwhelming majority of those divorces are initiated by women. So it does seem that these guys are right in some level that getting married is like playing Russian roulette with 2 to 3 loaded chambers in the gun.
No. Right. So if you look carefully at the book, and I know you have, I'm just saying, like, there are things that you can do, Aaron, to minimize your risk of divorce. Right. Yep. So that's part of the point of the book, is that yes, divorce is too high in my estimation, both for adults and for kids. And I have friends, who've been unwilling divorce, both actually women and men, more men than women, but I've got friends on both sides of the aisle who've been divorced for no good reason, guys and women that I know are good people, good spouses, good parents, and they were just kind of left high and dry. So that happens. I acknowledge that. And Pearl Davis makes some good points in that kind of arena. But the point is that there are ways to reduce your risk of divorce dramatically, right? And so I talk about 5 C's to a strong marriage. Okay. The first C is communion. The second C is children. The third C is commitment. The fourth C is cash. The fifth C is community. And I'll just touch on the middle group of those. So when it comes to communion, I think one mistake a lot of us men make, and certainly I've been guilty of this at times, right, is that we, in a sense, leave the romance for before the wedding day and don't keep it up after the wedding day. And so we have to work, I think, especially as men, to be emotionally attentive and engaged, affectionate, empathetic, doing all that emotion work that many of us men, find to be less natural to some extent. And so I talk about the value when it comes to communion of, for instance, going on a regular date night. And it looks like couples who do that, experience less divorce than couples who don't, make that effort. So just kind of keeping that romantic spark alive in your marriage is, I think, part of the story. The third C is about commitment, recognizing that both fidelity is an important value and virtue and requires you to kind of live a certain degree of self-control, both like in in-person relationships, like you're kind of a little bit guarded in terms of how you relate to people, so you're not going to put your marriage at risk. And then also online, that you're not doing stuff online that's going to get you into trouble with your spouse. So there, on the commitment front, there are things people can do to kind of, I think, minimize their risk of getting divorced. Actually, on the fourth C, cash, what I see is that for women, there's no consequence for wives of becoming unemployed in terms of the stability of their marriage. But for men, when they lose their jobs or they're fired, they're 33% more likely to end up getting divorced. So I think for men, just being a lot more intentional about, obviously you can get fired, but just, you're doing everything you can to be stably employed, because that's still, regardless of what people might say, in theory, in practice, as you know, Aaron,
yep,
stable employment for men is a key marker of both getting married in the first place, being attractive as a potential spouse, and then staying married in the second place. So kind of doing what you need to do to be stably employed for the guy, I think is, and then the final thing obviously is community. And there's a way in which, birds of a feather flock together. Divorce is incredibly networked, according to the work of Nicholas Christakis at Yale and his colleagues. They find that if like your best friend, your sister gets divorced, your divorce, skyrocket. But if your best friend and your sister never get divorced, if they handle, the ordinary difficulties of married life without heading to divorce court, your odds of divorce come way down. And so obviously one way to do this is to join a religious community, invest in that community, and surround yourself with other people who are intentional about being good husbands, good wives, good fathers, and good mothers. I'm not saying it's foolproof. We know it's not, but generally speaking, people who regularly attend church are between 30 and 50% less likely to end up getting divorced. So anyways, there are things you can do for, if you're thinking about responding to the Andrew Tate or the Pearl Davis argument about men and divorce, keep the romance alive, practice the virtue of fidelity, work hard, and surround yourself with friends who are on the best family first path.
Yeah, I mean, there is a ton of great stuff in the book that I call it news you can use to think about how to reduce your divorce risk. The one you laid out about divorce propagating through networks, I guess misery loves company. So somebody that gets divorced is obviously going to be evangelizing divorce. And like many other things are social. So it's like if you are aware of that and you see someone in your spouse's network get divorced, you can begin to be proactive about your own marriage to make sure that doesn't affect you. There's so many things in there you can actually use in the book in terms of that. And yeah, I mean, I've seen these different divorce risk calculators that in certain circumstances, your risk of divorce could be 10% or lower. Some of that basically depends on who you marry. But not all marriages have an equal likelihood of ending in divorce, some much higher than others. So there's a lot of great material in there. What do you think we need to do from a policy perspective to encourage and sustain marriages?
So I think we have to recognize kind of in big picture terms here, Aaron, at both federal and state levels, especially, because that's where you have the most, I think, although there's some local dimensions to this as well, is that marriage requires both resources, financially, we just touched on that before, but also requires a culture that's marriage friendly. And so when it comes to the economic story, what I would say is we've got to stop penalizing marriage with our means-tested programs like Medicaid and food stamps. I've talked to a lot of working class couples where, for instance, the wife, they're not married, but effectively the wife is on Medicaid. The kids are on Medicaid. They're not married because if they combine their income, they would lose access to Medicaid, and that would be a huge hit to their monthly.
I got relatives who are just like that, intentionally staying unmarried, even though they're living together, having kids together, because their benefits are all tied to being unmarried.
Yeah, so it's just insane that we have public policies, and they're not intentional, but they're there, that penalize marriage, primarily from the federal government. The second thing that I would say is that a lot of progressives and even some conservatives say there's nothing, Aaron, that can be done to policy-wise strengthen marriage. It's a fool's errand. But they don't realize that our nation's biggest federal agency is extremely successful in promoting marriage. What am I talking about, Aaron, do you think?
Which one is it? I know the answer, but I'll let you.
Okay, so you've heard this before.
Yeah, I've read the book. I actually read the book.
The biggest agency in America is the Department of Defense, right? And so we know, and I'm not saying that, military has its problems, a lot of stress, combat-related deployments, moving. These are not good for marriage. Happy to acknowledge that. But I'm just sort of saying the idea that marriage cannot promote marriage successfully is completely bunk, completely, untrue. And we know that because men who are currently serving in the U.S. military or have served in the U.S. military are way more likely to have gotten married compared to their roughly equivalent peers, and this is what's striking about this too, who haven't served in the military. What's striking is that the racial gap between whites and blacks is a lot lower in the military when it comes to who's getting married. And the sort of the gap between the college educated and less educated also looks to be smaller too. So point is that, if you're cohabiting in the military, your cohabiting partner is not going to get access to healthcare, is not going to get, access to a nicer house, housing option for the military, and I think some other benefits as well. So these clear benefits incent marriage in the military. And so I think given that reality, we should be thinking about policies that more explicitly incentivize marriage. So one idea is to give a 20% bonus when it comes to the child tax credit for married parents as a way of kind of signaling symbolically that marriage matters and giving people, financial incentive as well.
That's a great idea.
On the cultural side, though, we have to, acknowledge that there's a lot of voices, we've talked about them today, in the media and in social media now, and the culture more generally, that are kind of giving young adults profoundly anti-marriage messages and anti-parenthood messages now too. And so we have to, I think, begin to incorporate things like the success sequence, which is telling kids that education, work, and marriage before the baby carriage are 3 steps they can take to be financially successful or maximize their odds of being successful. But I think beyond that, just begin to think about more explicit messaging around the value of marriage and parenthood that would be targeted to kids in middle school and high school, and also thinking about PSA campaigns and social media that would be, run by creative nonprofits, could be funded through a mix of public and private, streams of support to counter a lot of the anti-nuptial and anti-natal messages. But so again, I think the government has to do more both on the economic front and the cultural front to help make marriage more attractive. And then on the family formation front, just say one thing quickly, and that is we've got to keep thinking about newer ways to make it easier to buy a small single family home with a small yard as a kind of bare minimum for people to get started when it comes to having kids. And so that requires, probably less regulation in some important respects, but also might require the states actually could step in and override local zoning, rules and regulations, just to make sure that we're maximizing our supply of, I think particularly, and some of the arguments I'm saying would like dovetail what someone like Matt Iglesias and other kind of moderates would say about kind of, housing market and laws and rules and regulations. But I think they are fans of like tall, dense apartment buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And we're getting more and more research from Southeast Asia and East Asia telling us that just there's something about density per se that is anti-natal. No one wants to raise a kid in a small apartment on the 17th floor of a major city, right? And so we have to think about, maximizing the supply of housing that's single family. And that's a challenge, but I think that's got to be the goal when it comes to, making the economic situation more family friendly for, ordinary Americans.
Yeah, and like during COVID in the urban areas, they shut down all the playgrounds. And, so we were lucky when we had a backyard in the house we were renting. And so we had a place for our son to play during COVID. So many things that urban areas do are kind of anti-child there. I want to wrap up with one last question. It's a little prognostication I'm going to ask here. If we really have a third of adults that never marry and you factor in divorces and these things, there is going to be a substantial block of 40 plus adults in America who are unmarried, either never been married or divorced, somewhere between a third and a half, I'm going to guess. What are going to be the social implications of having a society so divided between essentially the familial and the post-familial? What will that, apart from this sort of gender conflict you talked about earlier, what kind of dynamics do you see socially, culturally, politically playing out of the fact that we're going to have 2 completely different life scripts going for different people?
Yeah, this is an important question. I think, I talk about this somewhat in the State of Our Unions chapter in the book, talking about what we've seen in Japan and, where you're seeing obviously a lot of debt being accumulated by the government because there aren't enough kind of workers to sustain a decent tax base. So I think you're looking at some major fiscal challenges and probably reorganization when it comes to a lot of our means tested, and Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security as well too. So big fiscal problems for the state, I think, is going to be one part of the story. I think there's going to be more economic stagnation, less growth, also kind of playing out with fewer adults in the mix. I think there's going to be a lot of older people feeling lonely and vulnerable. And I think what we're seeing in Canada right now with the rise of euthanasia as a solution to, lonely in a sense and sick or disabled older adults, especially, kind of being seen as the answer, is going to become more common for a lot of people who don't have families, especially. But beyond that, I think we've already seen since 2000, happiness has been falling in America. There's different data sets that are pointing in this direction, and the number one factor here is marital status. So I think there's going to be a lot of, obviously there are plenty of singles who do fine. Again, I want to acknowledge that, but I'm just saying in general, people are less likely to flourish when they're single. So a lot more loneliness, depression, anxiety, unhappiness. And then, of course, the final piece here is just a lot of political and cultural polarization. I suspect that the single women, if the South Korean case is any, gives us any kind of guide to what's going to unfold here, are going to be turning pretty hard to the left, looking to the state to help them, in a variety of ways, both in financial security and other things. But the unmarried men, I think, and this is what's new, I kind of assumed that kind of the rise of the unmarried would push the electorate to the Democratic Party kind of uniformly. Of course, that was the assumption back in the day when it came to rising numbers of immigrants and Hispanics, that these new groups would kind of push the American electorate uniformly to the left and towards the Democratic Party. But I think if you look at South Korea, again, what you're seeing is a lot of these single men are angry and alienated, and they're attracted to anti-feminist messaging and to the right kind of in some way. So I think we could sort of see almost maybe sort of 4 different subcultures, Aaron, emerging, sort of like the reasonably happy married folks with kids and grandkids and, kind of living a relatively family-centered lifestyle. And then sort of the more progressive women who are, having their own, perspective, and often kind of they're angry with men and other things, as evidenced by how it's played out so far in South Korea. And then the single men who are angry too at the women, but they're heading in a different direction than the single women, politically and culturally. And it promises, it seems to me, like, more polarization and more populism and a more politically turbulent future than we have even today, which is saying something.
Well, it sounds like the solution is to get married.
Exactly.
And that is the title of the book, Get Married by Brad Wilcox. There's a link to buy it in the show notes. Be sure to check it out. So, Brad, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this book today. It's a great book. Highly recommended.
Thanks, Aaron. I appreciate the good word.